Greetings, my name is Gabriel. We are observers. Today I will tell you a little about Mars, about the Loch Ness Monster, and about the mysterious Yeti, Sasquatch or Bigfoot. And so, the history of Mars is really very interesting and could well compete with the history of your civilization during the heyday of Atlantis in its richness and unusualness of the events that took place then. In our system, the history of Mars was measured, since at that time only creatures lived on the planet and its satellites, the fourth level Orion and the reptilians, as well as naturally their henchmen the Greys. It was the only planet in this system, except of course the Earth and the dead planet of the Aryans, on which the creatures of the third ambimeric or fourth level ever lived, since only on it existed all the necessary conditions for these forms of life. Your science fiction writers have always instinctively understood this ancient connection between Earth and Mars and the fact that this planet played in the history of the Earth more than the primordial role in the evolution of the peoples who inhabited it. However, even now Mars is the only celestial body that stands in all its relief and temperature parameters closest to our planet. Of course, apart from size and with the necessary technology, it could replace on its surface countless settlements of colonists as when that long ago. Now, in order to understand who lived on this planet before it became as inhospitable as it is now, you need to accept as a fact that it was inhabited by three separate waves of colonists at different periods of its history. The first wave was exclusively representatives of the fourth level mentioned by me above, namely the Orions, Reptilians and Greys, who have used this planet since time immemorial for you as a kind of transfer station for a source of minerals and a kind of outpost for observing your planet. The second wave can be described as a certain part of the inhabitants of the planet of the Aryans who migrated during their voyages and so lunar system is also in search of resources and new outposts on the neighboring very hospitable planet of which Mars was then. This resettlement and colonization of Mars was a kind of part of a much larger expansion in time and space, while civilization the dead planet was at the peak of its development. As you already know, shortly before the death of their planet, hundreds of millions of Aryans managed to urgently move to this planet, since in all its characteristics it was most suitable in this system for this race, and only on the second the place was Mars because, being smaller in size, it had a slightly different gravity and other characteristics. As you remember, the Aryans themselves, like their descendants of the Atlantoria, had a height at a maximum of 3.5 meters and lived without problems like on this planet, which had a lower gravity thanks to the water bubble that surrounded it then, and on Mars, thanks to all the same characteristics. About a tenth immigrants, and maybe a little less who managed to settle on Mars before the death of their planet, subsequently managed to adapt well to the conditions of the then very hospitable Mars, whose landscapes were more reminiscent of those that can now be found approximately in the northwest of this country in some areas of Canada and Alaska. Everywhere dense deciduous forests rustled, picturesque snow-capped peaks of mountains rose and turbulent rivers gurgled. There were seas, and even oceans as well as many islands and active volcanoes then not inferior to Atlantis at the time of its highest heyday. The third wave of colonists of Mars was made up of the descendants of the Atlantorians who, several thousand years before the death of Atlantis, in pursuit of increasing power and military might, also arrived on Mars in the amount of several thousand and built here many colonies and pyramidal structures to receive cosmic energy. It was to this period that the construction of pyramidal structures in the Cydonia region belongs, which are the best examples of those monuments that were then erected by the Atlantoria. The so-called face on Mars, or the Martian Sphinx as you call it, was built on Mars many thousands of years before the real earthly Sphinx, and the three great pyramids in Egypt were erected on this planet in the post-flood period. The very face on Mars is a giant pyramidal structure of natural origin but artificially processed by the Atlantorians in order to have the characteristics of a pyramidal structure necessary for them. Mars suffered a disaster planets as a result of which rapid eddies rose on its surface, sweeping away everything in their path, and waves hundreds of meters high flooded many coastal areas for many hundreds of kilometers inland. Volcanic eruptions and catastrophic tectonic movements began, and therefore most of the settlements on the planet was swept from its surface in a relatively short period of time and suffered colossal losses in manpower. After that, as you remember, these two space bodies in tandem caused considerable damage to our planet. However, this was only the beginning of all the troubles for the Red Planet. If you remember Venus being, well, rightly assumed by many, a rather large cometary body after passing 1500 years later by earthly standards, or a little more after the first catastrophe, too close to it caused a serious disturbance in its magnetic field and launched a cascade of absolutely catastrophic events for this planet. Mars began to rapidly lose its atmosphere and protective magnetic field, which then it was. During the next about 10 Earth years, this planet became completely lifeless, since having lost its protective shell. Under the influence of cosmic rays and the solar wind, it lost all its flora and fauna. And to top it all off, when Mars was sent, as you remember, by Venus towards the Earth between him and our planet, a couple of decades after the Great Flood, a dangerously close approach took place due to which a colossal electric arc deprived him of almost all water and left monstrous scars on its surface. However, by the time this last catastrophe occurred, the descendants of all three waves of immigrants, each individually, took their own measures to save themselves from those destructive conditions, which they began to guess in advance and which did not hesitate to occur later. Some of them decided to move back to Earth. These were, as a rule, the descendants of the second wave and the third wave of the Atlantoria. At the same time, many of the remaining decided to build many underground bases on this planet, in which they could subsequently take refuge. And so it happened. Currently, this planet Mars is inhabited by a number of ambient Nordic Aryans of the descendants of those who once went to the underground Martian bases, and there are very few of them in comparison with the number that once lived here. And of course there are more numerous bases of inhabitants of the fourth level of the reptilians, Orions, Mars and its satellites Phobos and Deimos. All the inhabitants listed above, as you remember, treat people as third-class creatures, and therefore all your attempts to somehow penetrate, so to say, their interpersonal life are nipped in the bud. Just remember all those probes that disappeared on its surface or on approach to this planet. This is the current state of affairs. My name is Gabriel. We are observers. Today I will tell you about the transition. The planet is changing and its inhabitants have to transform as well. Unusually low temperatures of water and air, a rapid thinning of the ozone layer, and, as a result, the penetration of more and more into the upper layers cosmic radiation and solar wind, increased meteorite activity in near-Earth space. All these are the harbingers of great changes for those who can see. You can also name a couple more reasons, namely, the weakening of the magnetic field of the planet and the appearance of ever larger gaps like in our magnetosphere, and faults in the lithosphere, accompanied by methane emissions at the bottom of the seas and oceans, which affects both the air quality in the atmosphere and the water in the oceans, rivers and seas. As a result, the oxygen level in the water and the atmosphere is rapidly decreasing, influencing on the viability of all living organisms. Decreasing solar activity, due to the convergence of our star with its companion from the depths of space, is also a kind of strong stimulant of great changes in absolutely all habitats. The movement of the magnetic poles has acquired simply catastrophic proportions, which, as you remember, is a clear sign of a close inversion of the poles. The reason for the extinction of animals can be called the increasing electrification of the atmosphere of our planet due to both the approaching moment of the transition and other large celestial bodies, which, as you remember, must go through this region of the galaxy. As a result, birds can receive electrical shocks in the higher layers of the atmosphere, where such energy begins to accumulate in places of the so-called eddies of the magnetic field, or regions where many poles are formed. During strong solar storms or when the magnetic field moves along the inversion corridors, it is also dangerous for aircraft flying in the higher layers of the atmosphere, as the threat to hit such a mini-pole or be exposed to radiation from cosmic radiation or solar wind is now more high than ever. Well, of course, behind all these changes, as you may remember from previous conversations, there is nothing more than an upgrade of the entire consciousness on the eve of the transition. As gloomy as it may sound, but these cases of mass death of representatives of the second level, who made the choice to incarnate already after the transition on this planet in the form of creatures of the third level, while you will pass to the fourth, they unequivocally say that people will soon find themselves in the same position next. Consciousness makes its upgrade one by one, first, representatives of the second level, and then the third. That is, taking into account all the factors I have listed that lead to the death of these animals, fish and birds. There is more than an unequivocal reason to say that soon this planet will go through the next phase of changes, but at the same time, not animals and birds, but people will be disintegrating just as massively, since this time it is their habitat, due to these factors listed above, that will become unsuitable for life in general. This means a complete and irreversible collapse of the system in which you currently live, taking into account all the existing changes. I said more than once at the first meetings that you should take a closer look at the inhabitants of the second level, since it is their behavior, including the now increased mortality, that should give a hint as to what awaits people as a species in the very near future. In short, as always, be vigilant and watch out for the signs that are around you. These extinctions are just the beginning of something more, and they definitely will not end there. We are observers, and today I will tell you about several curious phenomena, about which there is still no consensus neither among the researchers of everything mysterious, nor among cryptozoologists. The first is the phenomenon of crop circles. What is its true nature? Who or what is behind this phenomena? What is the technology for reproducing these drawings? Do they mean anything in terms of messages? Does the place of their appearance depend on any regional peculiarities? So, all the crop circles available so far can be safely divided into 4 categories. The first and the smallest are pathetic forgeries of the most uncomplicated form, made by people, during the creation of which plants, of course, are hopelessly damaged, broken and show all signs of mechanical influence by brute force. The second category includes more complex drawings made by the technology of the 4th level, but either by representatives of the 3rd level, or by creatures of an aberrant nature. While the drawing, as a rule, is very close to the original, all the details, drawing, accuracy are observed, but very often in such cases, then in one, then in another picture, every now and then some incomplete or small error will slip through, which will indicate the author of such a picture, despite the prohibitive level of the technology used. The third category includes circles made by representatives of the 4th level using technologies of the same level. They represent the most perfect category of those listed so far, since they are almost 100% similar to the originals in all respects. The complexity of the drawing, the impeccable drawing of all the details will convince any uninitiated of the originality of such a creation. However, they usually have a small drawback. In such circles, patterns are created using technology, and therefore plants often do not grow further after they have been influenced and their biological growth and development is disrupted. And the last category of circles, which can be considered truly original and about which I would like to say more about the rest, created by none other than entities from the 6th level. They do not need to descend to our level or use a special technology, and therefore they can simply act with their power of intention or mental energy, since they represent, as you know, continuous light, energy, true knowledge and pure consciousness. They create by the power of intention a special wave through the levels of creation, which, in the form of energy vortices of a very high frequency, elusive to the human eye, passes to our level and in a certain given place puts the plants exactly as planned according to the original plan into the most complex in the degree of drawing and implementation of intricate patterns. And most importantly, it does not violate the main creative principle of plant growth and development. Such plants can easily develop further, as if they were not touched by mechanical action. And everything is explained very simply. The creative principle is not violated only by those entities that do not have a physical nature and intentions to serve themselves. And this is the 6th level. In these circles, and I mean exclusively those created by the 6th level, very important information is actually encoded about, as a rule, earthly changes or secret knowledge associated with the history of the past or with present events for humanity. This is a kind of one big almanac that librarians, keepers of all true knowledge, compose for those who can see and agree to understand the highest truths. Drawings can be deciphered either as a mathematical problem, or they carry the usual letter-type message. The place for them is naturally chosen not by chance, since, as a rule, the majority appears in places where the line between the worlds is especially thin and it is easiest for entities to penetrate our level. That is why there are so many crop circles in the British Isles, and especially in the vicinity of the Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, where the famous Stonehenge and its accompanying monuments are located. I think about circles. That's all for now. Today I will tell you about the Bigfoot and the monster living in Loch Ness. In this lake there really is a rare species of marine animal that survived in small numbers after cataclysms, and therefore could multiply and not die out for such a long period of time. It is on average no more than 12 meters in length and represents something very similar to a sea serpent, as they are depicted in old drawings. At the bottom of the lake there is a whole underwater colony of these creatures. There are at least 60 of them, according to the most conservative estimates. It has adapted well, and therefore it is not threatened with extinction yet. As for the nature of a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, everything is much more interesting and a little more difficult for your understanding. First, I must say that this creature does not live on this planet on a permanent basis, like, for example, the Loch Ness Monster, and therefore is not a natural part of the planet's ecosystem. It is, at least not from this dimension or level, so to speak. By its nature, the Yeti is a rather complex biorobot, whose characteristics are somewhat very similar to the principles on which other messengers of the fourth level exist at our level, such as, for example, the Greys. Bigfoot is a rather advanced cybergenetic creature and, like the Greys, has a number of very curious abilities, such as, for example, it can telepathically control the thoughts and will of other creatures, and also teleport at the request of those who launch it here to any point in three-dimensional reality. As a rule, he does the dirtiest work, collecting samples, making measurements, reporting on a particular ecological situation in a particular region. However, it is not mechanistic, like, for example, your probes, which you send with the same tasks to other planets and in environments unsuitable for you, to perform also the most black and primitive work in order to learn something new. But it is precisely a biological species in service to entities of the fourth level. Its nature, as far as I could find out, is also quite complex, since, like the Greys, it can be either a creature that thinks absolutely independently and has the rudiments of a soul, or it can be a type of probe, which is remotely controlled from the inside by different entities of the fourth level, as if transferring his consciousness into his body for closer contact with the studied environment. Much like in the movie Avatar. You also have probes of all kinds of nature, don't you? There are also such individuals who are sent here, seemingly according to the same scheme as the people in black, that is, they are simply projected through the portal between the levels into this reality, so that they seem quite real and physical, but at the same time the function of such messengers and the goals will also be different. In this case, there is still a rather interesting detail, which you can believe or not, but the homeland of this biological species before it was genetically changed for the needs of the fourth level, sometime in antediluvian times for you, was Mars, when on it, as now, on your planet, so the same rich flora and fauna. There were rivers, seas and oceans.